At the head of the table, my mother's voice rang out sharp and polished as crystal, calling my sister the perfect daughter, the pride of this family, then turning to me with the same smile and spitting out one word: failure. A few guests gasped. Forks froze midair, and I felt the blood rush in my ears, but I did not shrink this time. I am Olivia, the one she thought too small to matter. And as her laughter lingered, I slipped my hand into my bag and touched the envelope that would silence her forever. The pause stretched longer than anyone expected. A waiter shifted awkwardly near the dessert table, pretending to adjust the trays of eclairs. Someone cleared their throat in the back, but otherwise, silence wrapped around us all, thick and suffocating. The pause stretched longer than anyone expected. A waiter shifted awkwardly near the dessert table, pretending to adjust the trays of eclairs. Someone cleared their throat in the back, but otherwise silence wrapped around us all, thick and suffocating. My Aunt Carol, seated across from me, stared with wide eyes. She had always been careful not to get between my mother and me, but tonight, her expression betrayed something closer to admiration. My cousin Tommy leaned forward like he was watching a play unfold, hungry for the next act. My mother finally lowered the microphone, her knuckles pale against the silver stem. She tilted her head, feigning confusion, though the tightness around her eyes gave her away. "What exactly do you mean by that, Olivia?" she asked, her voice just a shade too sweet, the kind of tone that usually preceded a private scolding in the kitchen. I let the question hang, sipping the water in front of me. My hand trembled against the glass, but I kept my face still. I wasn't ready to reveal anything yet. Not here, not like this. But I wanted her to feel the weight of possibility, the idea that her control might be slipping. A murmur rippled through the tables. People whispered into their napkins, into their spouses' ears. I knew exactly what they were saying. The same things I had heard for years. Poor Olivia, the one who never quite measured up. The one who dropped out of law school, who moved from one idea to the next without the gleam of success her sister carried effortlessly. Sophia reached for her wine glass, her fingers delicate as always, her nails polished in a neutral shade. She avoided my eyes, though her husband Michael shot me a glance that hovered between pity and warning. He wanted me to stop, to smooth the night back into its intended celebration. But why should I thought? Why should I always be the one to swallow my pride, to bow my head, to play the part of family embarrassment, so everyone else could feel comfortable? The memory of late nights came rushing back. Me sitting at Grandma Rose's kitchen table in Cape Cod, her wrinkled hand resting on mine, as she told me I had worth, that I didn't need anyone else to tell me so. I remembered her words as clearly as if she had whispered them into my ear that moment, drowning out the chatter of the restaurant. I set down my glass and spoke again, still calm, still measured. Maybe someday you will realize that perfection is not what you think it is. Sophia finally looked at me, then her blue eyes uncertain, her lips parting as though she might speak. But she didn't. She never did when our mother was in the room. My father shifted in his seat, his suit jacket pulling tight across his shoulders. He cleared his throat but said nothing, just as he had done my entire life. His silence was louder than words, an endorsement of her cruelty. Margaret straightened, smoothing the skirt of her dress with one hand before lifting the microphone again. Her laugh was sharp, rehearsed. "Well, you will have to excuse my younger daughter. She gets emotional sometimes. Always did have a flair for the dramatic." The room responded with awkward chuckles, the kind that begged to be finished quickly. But I caught the glances, the way some of them lingered on me with curiosity. For once, I wasn't the invisible shadow sitting in the corner. For once, they saw me. I leaned back, folding my arms, giving my mother the faintest smile. I could feel her bristle, the way she hated that I wasn't shrinking into myself as usual. That was the first victory of the night, small but intoxicating. Dinner resumed slowly, conversations starting and stopping like engines reluctant to turn over. Plates of seared salmon and filet mignon appeared, servers moving between tables. The clinking of silverware tried to drown out the memory of what had just happened, but it lingered. Every laugh seemed forced, every toast brittle. I picked at my food, barely tasting it. My appetite was gone, replaced by a restless energy humming through my veins. My eyes wandered to the head table, where Sophia sat glowing beneath my mother's hand on her shoulder, a portrait of maternal pride. And yet even as Margaret smiled and gestured toward her, I saw the faint crack in her expression when she caught me watching. She was unsettled. She didn't know what I held in reserve, what I might say or do next. And that fear, that flicker of doubt, was more satisfying than any bite of food. I excused myself from the table under the pretense of fresh air. Outside, the night was cool, the cobblestone street lined with parked cars, and the faint sound of waves from the harbor beyond. I leaned against the brick wall of the restaurant, inhaling deeply, steadying my hands. I wasn't sure how long I had before someone came looking for me, but I knew this was only the beginning. Tonight wasn't just about enduring humiliation, not anymore. Tonight was about setting the stage for what came after. When I walked back inside, heads turned again, just for a second. I held my chin high, slid back into my chair, and let the night continue. The tension had not dissipated. It pulsed beneath the surface, and I knew everyone could feel it. I glanced at my mother one more time. She avoided my gaze, choosing instead to fuss with the flowers in the centerpiece. That alone told me everything. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one shrinking. She was. And the night was far from over. I could still feel the echo of that silence long after the clinking of silverware had resumed, and as I sat there, memories I thought I had buried began pressing against the edges of my mind. The weight of years came rushing back, each moment of being measured and found lacking, replaying itself in vivid detail. I remembered being 8 years old at the dinner table in our old colonial house on King Street. Sophia had come home with a perfect report card, straight A's once again. My mother beamed, her voice bright with pride, as she passed the sheet of paper around the table like a treasured family artifact. My father glanced at it, gave a brief nod, and went back to cutting his steak. When the paper reached me, I tried to hand it back without saying anything, but my mother caught the gesture. "Aren't you going to congratulate your sister Olivia?" She pressed her tone sharp, even through the smile on her face. I muttered something, heat creeping into my cheeks, while my father stayed silent, chewing, staring at his plate, as if the whole scene were beneath his notice. When the spotlight turned on me, it was never to celebrate. It was to compare. Margaret would shake her head at my drawing assignments, calling them childish, reminding me that creativity wouldn't pay the bills. She would sigh when I came home with a B, as though I had ruined the family's reputation single-handedly. Sophia excelled in science fairs and debate tournaments, while I scribbled stories in notebooks I kept hidden beneath my bed. Every dinner followed the same rhythm. Compliments for Sophia, critiques for me. Even my small victories were diminished. When I won a regional art contest in middle school, my mother barely looked up from her wine glass. "That is nice, Olivia," she said. "But your sister was just invited to shadow a surgeon at the hospital. That is real achievement." The guests that night clapped politely for Sophia, while my ribbon stayed folded in my lap. The worst part wasn't her sharp tongue. It was my father's silence. Richard sat at the head of the table, hands folded neatly, gaze steady on his plate or his drink. He never stopped her. He never told her enough. Sometimes I caught a flicker in his eyes, a moment where I thought he might step in, but it always passed, and he let her words fall unchallenged. High school was no different. Sophia was preparing her application for Harvard, her weekends filled with volunteer work and tutoring sessions. Meanwhile, I was caught sketching fashion designs in the margins of my math notebook. Margaret's voice still rings in my ears. "Olivia, when will you stop wasting time with nonsense and start thinking about your future?" Sophia never wastes her time. Look at her. She is everything we could want in a daughter. Even family friends joined in. At church picnics, people would pat Sophia's shoulder, telling my mother how proud she must be. Then their eyes would slide to me, their smiles thinner, their voices softer, as if they were offering condolences instead of congratulations. At night, lying in bed, I would imagine another version of myself, one who could stand at the table and shout back, one who could force them all to see me. But in reality, I sat quiet, chewing my food, slowly, letting their words stick to me like tar. Sophia left for Cambridge when she was 18, accepted early to Harvard with a scholarship that made the whole family buzz with pride. I remember standing in the driveway as they loaded her suitcases into the trunk of my father's car. Margaret kissed her cheek eyes wet with tears, and then turned to me with a look that was half warning, half disdain. "Don't think this means you can slack off," she said. I watched the car pull away, the sound of their voices echoing in my ears long after the taillights disappeared. College was supposed to be my escape. I chose a small liberal arts school in Vermont, away from the shadow of my sister's perfection. But even from miles away, the comparisons followed me. Phone calls home were brief and barbed. "Your sister just published in a medical journal," Margaret would say. "What are you doing with your time, Olivia?" I learned to keep my successes to myself, knowing they would never measure up to hers. Even holidays became unbearable. At Thanksgiving, Sophia would sweep into the house with stories of surgeries she had assisted on, professors who praised her brilliance. I would sit quietly at the end of the table, answering politely when spoken to, until inevitably the conversation turned toward me. "Olivia is still finding herself," Margaret would announce, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "Some of us take longer than others." The table would chuckle, and I would dig my nails into my palms beneath the tablecloth. The years stacked on each other, and so did the weight of it all. Microaggressions layered like sediment until they became a mountain pressing down on me. Every slight, every comparison, every silence from my father carved into me, shaping the person I became. And yet in the midst of it there were moments I clung to. A teacher in high school who praised my essays, a friend in college who said my ideas lit up the room, and Grandma Rose who told me in her soft but unwavering voice that being different was not the same as being less. Back in the restaurant that night, the memories blended with the reality before me. Sophia sat glowing in the spotlight of maternal approval, while I carried decades of being diminished in the shadows. But something inside me had shifted. No longer was I that silent child at the dinner table, shrinking beneath the weight of her words. The injustice of those years burned in my chest, but it was no longer the kind of burn that consumed me. It was fuel. And as I sipped the last of my water, my gaze locked once more on my mother across the room. I knew the time for silence was ending. The orchestra began to play softly, filling the gaps left by broken conversations. I let the music wash over me, steadying my breath. This night was meant to celebrate them, but in truth, it was becoming something else entirely. And deep down, I welcomed it. It was in 2019 when I finally took the step that no one in my family would have believed I was capable of. After years of being the afterthought, the one compared, the one dismissed, I signed the papers that created Aurora Tech. I remember the small office space in Cambridge above a coffee shop that smelled like burnt espresso and cinnamon. The walls were bare, the desk secondhand, but it was mine. For the first time I had built something with my own name attached to it. Aurora Tech was born out of an idea I had been sketching on napkins and scribbling into journals since college. Artificial intelligence for medical diagnostics. Not the flashy robotics people imagined when they heard AI, but algorithms that could sift through mountains of patient data, lab results, and case studies to give doctors faster, clearer insight. It was a seed of a dream, and I nurtured it like my own child. I poured myself into it. Nights blurred into mornings. I coded until my eyes burned, pitched ideas to anyone who would listen, and interviewed engineers who believed in the mission more than the paycheck. There were times when I thought I was insane, when I stared at the empty bank account and the stack of unpaid bills, wondering if my mother had been right all along. Margaret had caught whispers of what I was doing, though I never told her directly. A family friend once mentioned they had seen me in Kendall Square with a group of programmers, and she called me the next day, her tone dripping with disdain. "So this is what you are wasting your time on. A startup. A silly little project that will drain you dry and leave you with nothing." I held the phone to my ear, my jaw clenched, and gave her no satisfaction of a reply. When she hung up, I sat in silence staring at the wall, the anger in me hardening into resolve. It was during one of those restless weeks that David Miller walked into my life. He was a venture capitalist out of New York. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, the kind of man who could make or break a company with a single decision. He had heard about Aurora Tech from a mutual contact who had seen one of my early demos. When he invited me to meet at his office on Fifth Avenue, I almost didn't go. Part of me thought it was a mistake, a cruel setup for disappointment. But I boarded the train clutching my laptop like a lifeline. I will never forget the way he leaned back in his chair after I finished my presentation. His fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, not wide but certain. "Olivia, this is good," he said. "This is very good." He offered me seed funding that afternoon, more money than I had ever seen in my account. I walked out onto the bustling Manhattan sidewalk, the city roaring around me, and for the first time in my life, I felt the ground beneath me solidify. I kept the news to myself. Not even Sophia knew. It wasn't out of shame but strategy. I knew if I told my mother, she would twist it, mock it, diminish it until even I would question its worth. So I stayed quiet, building in shadows, letting Aurora grow unseen. My team expanded, our algorithms sharpened, and by late 2020, we had pilot programs running in 2 hospitals in Boston. Of course, Margaret still found ways to dismiss me. At Christmas that year, sitting around the long oak table with the smell of pine filling the room, she turned to Sophia and said she was proud of the lives she saved as a surgeon. Then she looked at me, her smile sharp. "And Olivia is still chasing her little projects. We can't all be doctors." The family laughed light and unbothered, and I smiled too, hiding the sting. If only they knew that those 2 hospitals were already using my algorithms to detect early signs of cancer more accurately than any doctor in the room. That was the irony of it all. They thought I was failing while I was quietly carving a place that even Sophia couldn't touch. My company's name was beginning to appear in niche journals and startup blogs. David kept telling me to prepare for bigger investors, for bigger rooms, but I wasn't ready to share it with the family. Not yet. Not until the moment it would cut deepest. Sometimes late at night in the office, I imagined that moment. Margaret sitting in her pearls, Sophia by her side, both so sure of their superiority. And me placing down a sheet of paper, the kind that could change the direction of a conversation, of a legacy. The fantasy fueled me through the exhaustion, the setbacks, the endless hours. The setbacks were real. We lost a major engineer to a competitor, and I spent nights rewriting code myself. A hospital administrator pulled out of a pilot at the last minute, worried about liability. My apartment in Cambridge was a mess of takeout containers and unopened mail. But I didn't quit. Every insult from my mother replayed in my head like a broken record, and I used it as fuel. Even when Margaret caught wind again, when she cornered me at Easter with her sharp smile. "So Olivia, I hear you are still playing with that startup nonsense. Has it made you a millionaire yet?" Her friends tittered behind their hands. I smiled, nodded, and excused myself. Inside, though, I repeated the words silently. Not yet, but soon. By 2021, Aurora Tech had doubled its staff. We were featured in a health innovation conference in San Francisco, where a panel of doctors praised our system as the future of diagnostics. I stood on that stage, my heart pounding, knowing none of my family had the faintest idea. And I wanted it that way. The longer they underestimated me, the sweeter the reveal would be. Back in the restaurant at Beacon Hill as the music played, and I sipped my water, I thought about those years. About the nights spent coding under fluorescent lights, about David's steady belief, about every time Margaret dismissed me as nothing. She thought she was shaping me into silence, but all she had done was forge me into steel. The room glowed with soft light chandeliers, reflecting against crystal glasses, laughter rising in uneasy waves. My mother's voice carried across the tables, proud and polished, her hand still resting possessively on Sophia's shoulder. No one could see the storm building beneath my calm exterior. And as I folded my napkin across my lap, my fingers brushed the edge of the paper tucked into my purse. Just the feel of it steadied me. It was not yet the moment to reveal it. But soon, very soon. The memory of Cape Cod in the summer of 2021 often comes back to me with the scent of salt in the air and the creak of the old porch swing where Grandma Rose used to sit. The house was weathered and small, tucked behind dunes and scrub pines, a place the rest of the family rarely visited anymore. To them, it was outdated, inconvenient, far from Boston's glitter. To me, it was sanctuary because she was there. When her health began to decline, Calls were made, discussions had, but no one volunteered. My mother said she was too busy with church committees. My father claimed the drive was exhausting. Sophia insisted the hospital demanded every ounce of her time. That left me. So I packed a bag, left my apartment, and moved into the spare bedroom in the Cape Cod house that smelled of cedar and old books. Days blurred into each other. I cooked simple meals, read aloud to her when her eyesight tired, and sat by her bed through long nights when the coughing fits came. She always reached for my hand, her skin paper thin, yet her grip still firm. There was no resentment in me for the responsibility. Instead, there was a strange peace. For once someone needed me, and I could give without fear of being judged for not being Sophia. Rose had always been different from the rest of the family. Where Margaret wielded words like knives, Rose offered quiet wisdom, a raised eyebrow, or a laugh that broke tension. Even in her frailty, her mind stayed sharp. She would tell me stories about her childhood during the Great Depression, about raising my mother with rules Margaret later bent into weapons. Sometimes, when her voice dropped, she admitted she regretted not standing firmer against Margaret's arrogance. One evening, as the light dimmed across the marshes and gulls called in the distance, she motioned for me to pull a small tin box from her dresser. Inside were letters, photographs, and a folded piece of paper. She did not let me read it, only held it in her hand as she whispered, "Fairness will come, Olivia. You must trust that." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I understood. A week later, she called a man named Ethan Clark to the house. He arrived in a dark sedan, tall in his early 50s, with a calm voice and a briefcase worn at the edges. He was a lawyer from Barnstable, one she had trusted for years. I made tea while they spoke in the living room, her voice low but steady as she explained what she wanted. I caught fragments, words like estate and will and certification. Ethan's pen scratched against paper, and when he left, he gave me a look that lingered a second longer than politeness required. It was not pity. It was assurance. That night she pressed my hand again. "You gave me your time, Olivia. That is what matters in the end. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." I swallowed back tears, promising silently that I would remember. By the spring of 2022, her body had grown weaker. She could no longer climb the stairs, so I set up her bed in the front room, where sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor each morning. The days became a rhythm of medication, soft music, and holding her hand as she drifted between sleep and wakefulness. The family visited rarely. Margaret came once, stayed less than an hour, and left after criticizing the curtains. Sophia sent flowers with a typed note. My father did not come at all. The night rose past the sea was restless outside, waves crashing against the shore as if marking the moment. I sat with her, listening to her breathing slow, until finally there was silence. My tears came quietly, not in torrents, but steady like the tide. I stayed by her side until dawn, when Ethan returned with documents and gentle words, guiding me through what needed to be done. The funeral was small, held in the white clapboard church she had attended for decades. The pews creaked under the weight of old neighbors, a handful of family members, and more than a few who had known her as a kind presence in town. Margaret wore black, but looked bored. Sophia dabbed at dry eyes, and I stood with a stillness I had not felt before. It was not just grief that held me upright, it was the knowledge that she had trusted me with something more. Afterward, Ethan asked to speak with me privately. We met again in his Barnstable office, where the smell of paper and ink hung heavy. He opened the same worn briefcase and slid a document across the desk. I saw my name there, bold and undeniable, and though my pulse quickened, I did not let surprise show. Ethan leaned forward. "She wanted fairness, Olivia, and fairness has a way of finding its place." I left his office with the Cape wind whipping at my coat, the document folded carefully in my bag. It was heavy, though it weighed almost nothing, heavy with the knowledge that one day it would speak louder than Margaret's sharpest words. I did not rush to use it. I let it wait like a card hidden in a sleeve until the moment the table demanded its reveal. Back in Boston, life resumed its chaotic rhythm. Margaret threw dinner parties, Sophia added accolades to her resume, and I continued to build Aurora Tech in silence. They went on believing I was drifting, failing the shadow of a daughter who could not measure up. And I let them, carrying the secret in my heart, strengthened by Rose's final words. Each time Margaret reminded me of my shortcomings, each time Sophia's success was paraded before me, I thought of that night in Cape Cod, of Ethan's calm assurance of Rose's frail hand squeezing mine, and I reminded myself that justice was patient, but it always arrived. The folded paper waited in the bottom drawer of my desk, untouched, but never forgotten. Every time I saw it, I felt Rose's presence again, her voice reminding me that fairness was not just a hope, but a promise. And though I went about my life as though nothing had changed, a part of me knew that when the day came when Margaret decided once more to humiliate me in front of an entire room, I would finally let the truth surface. The clinking of silverware had just settled when Margaret cleared her throat again, her voice slicing through the warm hum of conversation. She raised her glass, a practiced smile stretched across her face, and gestured toward Sophia, who sat prim and polished beside her. "Our Sophia," she said, "is the pride of this family. A doctor, a mother, a woman of true accomplishment. Look at her, such grace, such success." A few guests nodded, others murmured polite agreement. My mother's gaze shifted deliberate toward me. Her smile did not falter, but her eyes sharpened like blades. The silence that followed was heavier than the praise. Guests stole glances in my direction, waiting, wondering if Margaret would continue. She did not need to. The message was clear. One daughter, a shining jewel, the other, a tarnished stone. I sat still, my fingers pressed lightly against the stem of my glass, my breath steady, though my chest felt tight. Sophia lowered her eyes to her plate. She did not smile, did not join in the chorus of praise. Yet her silence was complicity, as always. It was easier to let Margaret crown her than to speak up. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fork tracing the edge of his plate, but his mouth remained closed. He had perfected the art of vanishing, even when present. A murmur rippled through the table, some voices soft with pity, others with discomfort. I caught fragments. Poor Olivia, always the same. She tries but never measures up. I let the words brush past me, each one sparking a flame that I refused to let show. Margaret raised her glass higher, waiting for applause. Instead, the room grew quieter. Even the chandeliers seemed to stop their subtle sway. I pushed my chair back, the scrape against the hardwood sharp and final. Every head turned. I stood lifting my own glass, the ruby liquid catching the light. My movements were measured, not rushed. My mother's smile faltered for the first time. I met her eyes across the table, and the air tightened, drawn into an invisible rope stretched between us. Guests stilled forks, suspended conversations abandoned. The only sound was the faint hum of the heating system above. I took a breath, long and steady, and tilted my glass slightly as if in salute. The look in her eyes hardened, her jaw clenched. She had expected me to sit silent, to shrink as I always had. My voice was calm when it came. "Congratulations," I said, holding her gaze. "Your daughter is indeed remarkable." I let the words hang in the air, every syllable cool as steel. Then after a beat I added, "Both of them are." The tension cracked like thin ice. Gasps came from somewhere near the back of the room. Sophia's fork slipped from her hand and clattered against her plate. Richard's head lifted, surprise written across his face. Margaret's smile was gone entirely, now her lips pressed into a thin line. For a long moment we stood like that, mother and daughter, locked in silent combat, the guests frozen in the crossfire. The chandeliers above flickered as if the room itself had drawn breath. I did not look away. I would not. Her eyes searched mine, perhaps for weakness, for a tremor, for the familiar retreat she had always won. But this time, she found none. Sophia reached for her water, her hand trembling slightly. She tried to break the silence, murmuring something about the food, but no one listened. All eyes stayed on me, on Margaret, on the standoff that no one had expected, but everyone had sensed brewing for years. Finally, I lowered my glass, set it gently back on the table, and eased into my chair again. The gesture was quiet, but final, an exclamation point without words. The room exhaled all at once, whispers darting across the tablecloth like restless birds. Margaret remained standing, her glass hovering midair, her face composed but pale beneath the makeup. Slowly, with deliberate care, she sat back down. She said nothing. I could feel the pulse in my wrist, slowing the fire in my chest, settling into embers. Around me the dinner resumed, but it was not the same. Every laugh was brittle, every clink of silver hollow. People shifted uneasily, glancing at me with something new in their eyes. Not pity, not dismissal. Something closer to respect, though they did not dare voice it. Sophia leaned toward me slightly, her whisper barely audible. Why now? I did not answer. Instead, I reached for the breadbasket, broke a piece, and let the silence speak for me. Margaret's hands stayed tight around her napkin, twisting the linen until it creased. She avoided my eyes, focusing instead on the candlelight dancing in the centerpiece. Yet I knew she felt it. The shift. The balance tipping ever so slightly in my favor. For the first time, the weight was not mine alone to carry. I remembered a different night years earlier when Margaret summoned me into the den of our old house in Newton. The smell of polished wood and her perfume mixed in the air, cloying and heavy. She had placed a stack of papers neatly on the desk, her nails tapping against the top page in rhythm with my pulse. You need to sign this, Olivia. Her voice was smooth, final, not an invitation to discuss, but an order. I was 24, raw and uncertain, and Sophia's shadow seemed to loom over everything I did. My mother leaned closer, her eyes sharp with that familiar disapproval. This will avoid confusion later, she said. Your father and I want everything to be clean for the family. The implication was clear. I was the confusion, the mess she needed to tidy up. I glanced at the words on the page. Waiver of inheritance rights. The letters blurred as my throat tightened. My hands trembled not from disbelief but from the force of her presence. She had chosen a night when my father was away on a business trip, when Sophia was at a residency shift when I was alone. I asked what would happen if I refused. Her lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. Then you show me who you really are, an ungrateful child who bites the hand that feeds her. The silence pressed against me like a wall. I thought about the endless dinners where she mocked my choices, the whispers of neighbors repeating her words, the sense that no matter what I achieved, it would never matter. I signed. The pen felt heavier than it should have, dragging my name across the line like an admission of defeat. She took the paper quickly, folding it into a folder, her eyes satisfied, but cold. Good. Now we can all move forward. I walked out of the den that night with a pit in my stomach, the weight of shame knotted so tightly it felt permanent. Years later, in 2019, when Aurora Tech began to take shape, I confided in Ethan Clark, the attorney I had met through a mutual friend in Cambridge. We were sitting in his office, walls lined with books, the faint hum of traffic outside. I told him everything about the night in the den, the paper, the way Margaret's words had pressed me into compliance. He listened without interruption, his hands folded neatly on his desk. When I finished, he leaned back, thoughtful. Olivia, he said that paper doesn't hold the weight your mother thinks it does. You were not represented, the circumstances show coercion, and without proper witnesses, it is at best symbolic. At worst, it exposes her manipulation. The knot I had carried for years loosened slightly. He advised me to keep any copy, any record of that night. I told him she had given me one under the guise of transparency, but I had hidden it away. Later, I had taken it to be notarized quietly, making sure it was preserved as evidence of her tactics. Ethan nodded, satisfied. One day this could matter more than you think. I left his office that evening with the crisp winter air biting my cheeks and a strange sense of quiet strength blooming inside me. For the first time, the shame I had carried did not feel permanent. It felt like proof, a record of what she had done, and I tucked it away, not with fear, but with purpose. Back at the dinner table in Boston years later, as Margaret's words wrapped themselves around Sophia in praise and around me in disdain, I felt the echo of that night in the den. She thought she had stripped me of power then. She thought the paper was a victory. But what she had given me was a weapon silent and waiting. Sophia's laughter rang out faintly at the other end of the table, brittle and thin. I studied her face the way her smile never reached her eyes. Did she know about that night, about what Margaret had forced me to sign? Or had she simply accepted the version of the story Margaret had crafted, where I had no place, no claim, no worth? Richard caught my eye briefly, a flicker of something unspoken, maybe guilt, maybe recognition, before he looked away again. He had never asked what went on in those late-night conversations with Margaret. Perhaps he did not want to know. Perhaps silence was easier for him than facing the truth. I sipped my wine, the bitterness grounding me. The memory of that pen scratching across the paper had once haunted me, but now it fueled me. Every humiliated laugh, every whisper of pity from neighbors, every time she used Sophia's success to erase me, was balanced against that folder I kept hidden. Margaret straightened in her chair, her pearl necklace catching the light. She launched into another story about Sophia's achievements at the hospital, her patients, her accolades. Guests leaned in, nodding dutifully. My hand rested on the stem of my glass, steady now. She had built this entire narrative of perfection and failure, but she had overlooked her own cracks. I thought of Ethan's calm voice, the certainty in his eyes, when he told me the paper had no real power. I thought of Grandma Rose, her words whispered in Cape Cod, that fairness always finds a way. The threads were weaving together slowly but surely. The night in the den was no longer just a memory of shame. It was part of the ledger, part of the story she had written for me, without realizing I had been keeping a copy of every line. As laughter flickered around the table, thin and uncomfortable, I let my eyes settle on Margaret. The past was no longer buried. It was waiting ready, and when the time came, it would surface in a way she could never control. The night before the anniversary dinner, the city of Charleston felt unusually heavy, as if the humid air itself knew what was about to unfold. I drove through the quiet streets toward Ethan Clark's office, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The low hum of the radio filled the silence, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying every word Margaret had ever used to cut me down every time she had made sure I knew my place. Ethan's office sat in a historic brick building near Meeting Street, the kind with tall windows and brass fixtures polished to a shine. I pushed open the glass door and stepped into the faint smell of old books and fresh coffee. Ethan was already waiting behind his desk, sleeves rolled up, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He rose when he saw me, his expression calm, almost too calm. "Olivia, thanks for coming." His voice was steady, but I caught the edge of something heavier beneath it. He gestured toward the chair across from him, and I sat trying to mask the unease twisting in my stomach. He slid a thick manila envelope across the polished wood surface. Inside, he said, "Is your grandmother's final will, notarized and recorded in 2022. It is valid, Olivia. Beyond contestation." My fingers brushed against the envelope, the paper cool and solid, heavier than it looked. I opened the flap, slowly pulling out the neatly bound document. The words blurred at first, until I forced myself to focus. 80% of Grandma Rose's estate, valued at approximately $12 million, listed under my name. Properties in Cape Cod, accounts assets. Sophia was left with a symbolic share, and Margaret nothing. The air in my lungs seemed to vanish. I looked up, searching Ethan's face for reassurance. "Are you sure this can't be overturned?" My voice cracked despite my best effort to keep it steady. He leaned back, folding his hands. "It is airtight. Witnessed, notarized, filed correctly. Margaret may try, but the law is not on her side." He paused, his eyes sharpening. "But she will not go quietly. She will fight you with every ounce of her pride, her influence, her venom." The words settled into me like stones. I knew he was right. Margaret had always lived for appearances, for control. Losing both wealth and reputation in front of her circle would be unbearable. I glanced back down at the will. Grandma's handwriting appeared in a note at the end, shaky but deliberate, her last words. "Fairness finds its way." My throat tightened, memories flooding back of quiet evenings in her Cape Cod home, her hand resting on mine as she told me I was stronger than I believed. Ethan's voice cut through my thoughts. Olivia, once you decide to reveal this, there is no turning back. She will come after you harder than ever before. The question is, are you ready to withstand it? I folded the document carefully and slid it back into the envelope. My fingers hesitated, then tightened around the flap as if sealing my resolve. I slipped it into my bag, feeling its weight settle there like a second heartbeat. I do not know if I am ready, I admitted. But I know that if I stay silent, nothing will change. Ethan studied me for a moment, then nodded. His eyes softened. Then you already know what you have to do. Silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable, but heavy with the gravity of choice. Outside, the city lights glowed through the tall windows, casting long reflections across the office floor. I thought of Margaret's sharp smile, Sophia's obedient silence, my father's refusal to intervene. I thought of every dinner where my existence was the punchline. Ethan stood and walked me to the door. He placed a steady hand on my shoulder. Whatever happens tomorrow, remember that the law is with you. And so is the truth. The night air hit me as I stepped outside, cooler now, the wind carrying the faint scent of salt from the harbor. I walked slowly to my car, the envelope pressing against my side inside the bag. I wanted to believe his words, to lean on the certainty of legality and truth, but the battle I knew was coming was not just about the law. It was about Margaret's pride, her power, her ability to bend people with a look. I drove home through streets lit by street lamps and the occasional neon sign, the silence of the car wrapping around me like a cloak. At a red light, I reached into my bag and touched the envelope again, as if to confirm it was real. $12 million, 80%. Words and numbers that could shatter the narrative Margaret had spent her life constructing. When I finally reached my apartment, I left the lights off and sank onto the couch. The city hummed faintly through the windows, a lullaby of traffic and distant laughter. I held the envelope in my hands, tracing its edges, whispering to myself that tomorrow was the day everything would shift. The envelope rested on the coffee table as I poured myself a glass of water, the condensation dripping down the side of the glass. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if I had the courage to do what needed to be done, wondering if Margaret already suspected what I carried. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's face twisting with fury, my father's silence, Sophia's widened eyes. I lay awake, the envelope still in the bag by my bed, and listened to the city breathing outside my window. By the time dawn light crept through the blinds, my decision had not grown lighter, but it had solidified. The paper would not remain hidden forever, and when it surfaced, it would change everything. The chatter of silverware and hushed voices filled the banquet hall, until my mother's voice rose above it all once again. Margaret was glowing, basking in her own performance, as if the evening had been orchestrated solely to showcase her favorite daughter. She turned her gaze toward me, sharp and cold, her lips curling into that familiar smirk. "There she is," she said loudly enough for the room to hear, our little dreamer still clinging to childish ideas. "Some things never change." A ripple of laughter passed through a few of the guests, nervous and eager to please her. I felt the sting, the heat rising in my chest, but I did not flinch. Instead, I reached slowly into my bag, resting on the chair beside me. My hand closed around the envelope, the edges pressing firmly into my palm. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing now, Olivia? Another one of your silly theatrics?" Her tone dripped with condescension. I stood, pushing my chair back with a calm steadiness that drew eyes from every corner of the room. The conversation stilled, the forks paused mid-air. I laid the envelope on the white linen tablecloth and opened the flap with deliberate care. The rustle of paper seemed deafening against the silence. I pulled out the document and unfolded it carefully, the crisp pages catching the glow of the chandelier above. Without a word, I placed it in the center of the table. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then I heard the first sharp inhale. Sophia's face drained of color, her glass trembling slightly in her hand. Michael leaned forward, his brows furrowing, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. My father. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his chair creaking as he leaned back, his eyes darting between me and the paper. Margaret laughed, brittle and forced. "What is this supposed to be? Another fantasy you've written to amuse yourself. I didn't respond. I let the paper speak for itself, its official stamps and notarized seals gleaming under the light. The weight of silence grew unbearable. I could hear whispers ripple along the table, questions and speculations in hushed tones. "Is that a will?" someone murmured, from her grandmother. Another voice followed, softer but clear. "Looks official." Margaret's laughter faltered. She leaned forward, snatching the edge of the document, but her hand froze when she caught sight of the signatures at the bottom. Her jaw tightened, her eyes darting across the lines with frantic speed. Sophia leaned closer, her lips barely moving. "Mom, is this real?" Richard finally spoke, his voice low, strained. "Margaret, answer her." But Margaret said nothing. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the table. I remained still, standing tall, my eyes fixed on her. The silence was louder than any accusation I could have spoken. The tension thickened, every second stretching. Guests exchanged wary glances, their curiosity overtaking their discomfort. Some leaned forward to catch a better glimpse, others whispered behind their hands. I folded my arms, my voice steady when I finally broke the silence. "You always told me I had nothing, that I was nothing." But it seems Grandma Rose didn't agree. The words landed like a stone in a still pond, sending invisible ripples through the room. Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, while Sophia's lips parted in disbelief. She shook her head slightly as if trying to erase what she had just seen. Margaret's face burned red, her composure cracking. "This means nothing," she spat, her voice trembling with fury. "Nothing at all." But her words rang hollow. The document sat between us, undeniable, immutable. I didn't need to say more. The power was not in my explanation, but in the silence, the undeniable reality of the paper on the table. Every pair of eyes was fixed on it, on me, on her. The room seemed to close in the chandelier light, suddenly too bright, the air too thick. I could hear the faint rustle of a dress, the clink of a glass set down too hard. The orchestra in the corner, unsure of whether to continue, faltered and fell silent altogether. For a moment, it felt as if time itself had stopped. No one ate, no one spoke. Margaret's facade had cracked and everyone could see it. I let the silence stretch, savoring the rarest thing I had ever known in this family control. The paper lay there untouched, a weapon, without me needing to raise a hand. The weight of their stares pressed against me, but I stood steady. I had waited my whole life for this moment, and I was not about to shrink from it. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flashing with a fury she could not mask. She leaned back, folding her arms tightly across her chest, as if by sheer force she could will the moment away. But the moment was not hers anymore. It was mine. The room remained locked in that frozen state, no sound but the faint hum of the air conditioning, no movement but the rise and fall of shallow breaths. And still the paper stayed where I had placed it, silent and unyielding, while every soul in the room felt the ground beneath them shift. I reached for the paper again, unfolding it slowly, so every crease echoed in the silence. My voice was calm, steady, when I began to read. The last will and testament of Rose Whitman, my grandmother. I paused deliberately, letting the words settle in the air. The room leaned in, waiting, holding its breath. "It is my wish that the majority of my estate, including my properties in Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard, along with financial assets, be transferred to my granddaughter, Olivia Grant, for her unwavering care and devotion during my final years." I stopped there, my eyes rising to meet my mother's. The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt like the air itself had turned to stone. Margaret's face blanched, her lips parting slightly, a tremor flickering across her jaw. "No," she whispered, barely audible. Then louder, her voice cracking. "No, this is a lie. This is a forgery." Sophia gasped, her chair scraping against the floor as she leaned forward. "Mom, stop. Look at the seal. Look at the signature." Richard's hand went to his forehead, his breathing uneven, his shoulders sagging under a weight he could not deny. I turned back to the document, my voice cutting through Margaret's protests. The remaining portion of the estate shall be divided equally among the other children and grandchildren, with the stipulation that any prior agreements made under duress or coercion are hereby void. Her words from years ago forcing me to sign away my rights crumbled in the light of my grandmother's clarity. The murmurs rose louder, guests twisting in their seats, some shaking their heads, others whispering in awe or scandal. Margaret slammed her hand down on the table, the glasses rattling from the force. "This is not real. You think you can humiliate me with some piece of paper? Everyone knows you are weak. You are nothing. You could never deserve this." The rage in her voice revealed more than she intended. The desperation clung to her words like smoke. Before I could respond, a figure rose from the back of the room. Ethan Clark adjusted his glasses, the quiet authority of his presence commanding attention. He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "This document is authentic. I was present when Rose Whitman signed it. I notarized it myself. It has been filed and recorded according to Massachusetts law." The effect was instant. The gasps, the whispers, the shifting glances. Margaret's fury found no foothold. Her face twisted, her eyes darting between Ethan and the document, searching for escape, and finding none. Sophia's lips quivered. "Mom, please, stop. People are watching." Margaret rounded on her. "You think she deserves this? You think after everything she can just walk in here and steal what is ours?" "Ours," I repeated softly, my voice steady and sharp. "Or yours. Because let's be honest, Mom, it was never about family. It was always about control." The words cut through her like glass. She recoiled, her hands clutching the back of her chair, knuckles white. Michael shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. I had rarely seen him speechless, but the weight of the moment held him in silence. Richard tried to rise, his voice cracking. "Margaret, sit down. This is enough." But she did not sit. Her chest heaved, her eyes wild. She looked like a queen watching her crown slip from her head in front of her entire court. The guests around us became restless, torn between fascination and discomfort. Some avoided looking directly at her, while others could not tear their eyes away. I placed the document back on the table, my fingers smoothing the page. My voice was low but clear. Grandma Rose wanted fairness. She trusted me to see it through. Margaret shook her head violently. "No, no, she was manipulated. This was your doing. You poisoned her against me." Ethan's voice was unshakable. "Mrs. Grant, your mother was of sound mind. She gave explicit instructions, and she left no doubt of her intentions." The words landed like nails in a coffin. Margaret's shoulders sagged for the briefest moment, then stiffened again, as pride wrestled with panic. The room felt alive with tension, every breath shallow, every glance sharp. I could feel the shift, the balance tipping. Margaret's voice dropped low and venomous. "You think this makes you powerful? But you will regret this. You will regret humiliating me tonight." I met her eyes unflinching. "The regret is yours, Mom, because you underestimated me." The silence that followed was louder than any applause. The room was still, the truth laid bare, the foundations of her control shattered. And though the storm had only begun in that moment, the tide had turned, and everyone in that room knew it. Margaret's voice cracked as she shouted, her fury spilling into the room like fire no one could put out. She pointed at me, her hands shaking, her words slurred by rage. "You think you're better than me now? You've always been a disappointment. This is nothing but a trick." Sophia broke down, tears spilling down her cheeks as she buried her face in her hands. Her sobs cut through the noise, her shoulders trembling. She had always been the one held up as perfect, untouchable, the pride of the family. Now her voice wavered, almost childlike. "Why didn't Grandma trust me? Why wasn't I enough?" Richard tried to rise, his hand gripping the back of his chair as if to steady himself. His face was pale, sweat gathering along his brow. He looked at Margaret, then at me, and then down at the floor. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "I should have said something years ago. I should have protected you." Michael leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his jaw tight. His eyes darted from my mother's anger to Sophia's tears, to my calm expression. He had no words, only confusion, his silence speaking of a man caught in a storm he never wanted to enter. I remained steady, my hands folded neatly in front of me, the document resting quietly on the table. I felt no surge of triumph, no glee. There was only a quiet certainty, a sense that justice had finally spoken where I could not. Margaret's shouting grew louder, her voice almost breaking. "This is not over, Olivia. I will fight this. You will not ruin this family." The room was thick with tension guests, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, some exchanging looks that carried pity, others disdain. A few whispered their voices, barely above the hush of shame settling over the night. Then came a voice clear and deliberate, cutting through the chaos. Linda, the neighbor who had known us for decades, leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "This isn't ruin, Margaret. This is justice. This is finally fair." The words landed like a blade. Margaret froze, her face twisting, her lips trembling. The room reacted as if someone had drawn a line in the sand. A few nodded in agreement, others gasped at Linda's bluntness. Margaret's hands curled into fists, her chest rising and falling violently. Her pride had been slashed open, and the wound was bleeding in front of everyone she had spent years trying to impress. Sophia cried harder, whispering into her hands. She felt abandoned, stripped of the pedestal that had defined her. I could hear her words in fragments. Why her? Why not me? Richard sat back down, his eyes glassy, his shoulders slumped. He looked broken, as though the weight of decades of silence had finally crushed him. His guilt hung in the air like smoke. Michael rubbed his forehead, his breathing shallow, his voice low enough that only those near him could hear. "I don't even know what this means anymore." I lifted my glass not to toast, but to steady my hands. My voice was calm, measured, carrying enough strength to silence the room once more. "This isn't about destroying anyone. It's about the truth finally being acknowledged." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every eye in the room was on me, some filled with admiration, others with unease. Margaret's face hardened, her eyes burning into me with a hatred that felt bottomless. Linda sat back in her chair, unflinching, as if she had said what needed to be said and would not take it back. Her words lingered heavier than Margaret's screams, sharper than any accusation. The family I had grown up with stood fractured before me, each of them shattered in different ways. Sophia drowning in tears, Richard lost in regret, Michael trapped in doubt, and Margaret writhing in humiliation. And me at the center, not triumphant but resolute, unwilling to shrink again under the weight of their judgment. The night pressed on the atmosphere thick with all that had been said, and all that could never be taken back. The damage was done, and no one in that room would leave untouched by it. Word traveled faster than I could have imagined. By Sunday morning, the whispers from that dinner table had spilled into the pews of our church in Cambridge. Eyes followed Margaret when she walked through the doors, no longer with admiration, but with curiosity, sharpened by judgment. She wore her pearl necklace tighter than ever, but nothing could cover the cracks that had begun to spread across her image. I sat in the back row, half hidden, listening as women from the choir murmured while hymns played softly overhead. They spoke in low voices, but I caught fragments. How could she humiliate her daughter like that? "Did you hear about the will?" Olivia was the one caring for Rose. Each word that reached my ears felt like a tide pulling me out of the shadows. Sophia walked beside Margaret, her eyes red, her smile weak and forced. I heard someone whisper that her patients at the hospital were already talking. Perfection once her armor had become a target. People were questioning whether she deserved all the praise she had been showered with, or if she had been lifted so high only because Margaret demanded it. I did not linger after the service. I slipped out quietly, feeling the cool Boston air hit my face, as if the world outside was finally different, less suffocating. At home, I made tea and sat by the window scrolling through my phone. My name, once avoided, now appeared in thread after thread on community forums and social media. There were posts titled "Justice for Olivia." Others praised Grandma Rose's foresight, calling her decision bold and fair. Strangers, people who had never known me beyond whispers, were suddenly defending me with ferocity. I had expected anger, perhaps disbelief, but instead there was recognition. The narrative had shifted. Comments read, "She was never a failure. Margaret just never saw her worth." Another said, "Every family has a child who is overlooked, but sometimes that child is the one carrying the most." I set the phone down, my chest rising and falling slowly. For the first time in my life, I was no longer invisible. It was a strange kind of validation, one that brought warmth and weight at the same time. The next week, as I focused on Aurora Tech, I found my inbox flooded. Messages from reporters, from acquaintances I had not heard from in years, even from distant relatives who suddenly wanted to reconnect. I ignored most of them. What mattered was the work. Late one night, I stayed in the office long after my team had gone home. The glow of the computer screen painted the room in pale light. I opened my email and froze when I saw David Miller's name. My hands trembled as I clicked. His message was brief, but the impact was enormous. "Olivia, after reviewing the progress reports and your vision for the next phase, I am ready to move forward. The documents for the Series A investment will be ready for signing next week. Congratulations." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen as my throat tightened. For years I had carried the weight of being dismissed, of being told my work was meaningless. And now here it was. Proof that the seed I had planted had not only grown, but was recognized by one of the most respected investors in Boston. I thought of Margaret, of the way she used to laugh whenever she overheard me talking about Aurora. Startup nonsense, she had called it. I thought of Sophia, of the pedestal she had been placed on only to find it crumbling under her. I thought of Grandma Rose, her frail hands gripping mine as she whispered, "Justice will come." It was coming. Not with fury or vengeance, but with quiet, undeniable momentum. I closed my laptop and let the silence of the office settle around me. Outside, the city hummed indifferent and alive. For the first time, I felt that the narrative of my life was no longer written by my mother's disapproval or my sister's shadow, but by my own choices. And deep inside, I knew the storm was not yet over. The dinner had been the spark. The fire was still spreading, and its light was only beginning to reach the corners that had been dark for far too long. I drove south that weekend, the highway stretching out before me as the winter sky over Massachusetts carried a pale light that looked almost silver. The air grew saltier the closer I came to Cape Cod, and with every mile I felt the weight in my chest loosen, as if the very act of leaving Boston behind was peeling layers of bitterness away. The envelope rested in the passenger seat, sealed again, quiet and heavy with meaning. When I pulled into the familiar driveway of Grandma Rose's cottage, the house looked smaller than I remembered, yet it still held the same warmth in its worn shingles and the porch that leaned slightly to one side. I carried the envelope inside, pausing in the hallway, where the faint smell of lavender lingered, just as it had in her final days. I placed the document on the small wooden table she had always called her altar, where a framed photograph of her younger self stood beside a vase of dried hydrangeas. My hand lingered on the paper as my voice finally broke the silence. I kept my words low, steady, as though she were sitting across from me. I told her I had kept my promise, that the truth she had trusted me to carry had finally seen the light. There was no triumph in my tone, only a quiet release. I did not need to shout. I did not need revenge written in destruction. All it had taken was a single piece of paper, one truth placed in the center of a room filled with lies, and it had shattered the facade louder than any scream could have. I sat for a long time in the cottage, listening to the wind outside. Memories of nights spent here returned when I had made her tea and read aloud to her while she drifted into sleep. Back then, I had felt invisible, cast aside by my own mother, overshadowed by my sister. But to Grandma Rose, I had mattered. She had seen me. And in the end, she had given me the greatest gift anyone could offer. Not the property, not the wealth, but the validation that my worth was never dependent on Margaret's approval. I left the envelope on the altar beside her picture. The legal battles were over, the whispers in the church had already spread, and my mother's voice no longer had the power to define me. As I walked out to the porch, the sky had opened just enough for the sun to break through, spilling light across the frozen yard. It was faint, but certain, like the first note of a song that would not be silenced. On the drive back, I thought of my family. Margaret would never forgive me, and perhaps she was never capable of it. Sophia might someday see that my victory was not her loss, but that was for her to reckon with. My father would continue to wrestle with his silence, a silence that had cost him as much as it had cost me. None of it changed what had already been written. Aurora Tech awaited me. My team, my investors, the future I had carved for myself, all stood outside the shadow of my family's disdain. For the first time, I felt as though my life was my own and it was enough. I did not return to Boston to boast or to celebrate. I returned simply to live, to continue. Because survival had never been my goal, truth was, and the truth had done its work. I did not take revenge in blood or fire. I took it in silence, in patience, in the unveiling of reality. And reality laid bare was the sharpest weapon of all. If this story has touched you, stay with me. There are more journeys of justice and dignity waiting to be told, stories of voices once silenced that finally found their way to speak.